A Hollywood mogul discovered a young actress in France and became so obsessed that he changed her professional name to a combination of his own name and his wife's name. A public declaration of ownership. He left his family, launched a massive publicity campaign to make her a star, then discarded her the moment her films flopped. 15 years later, she turned on the gas in her Paris apartment. Her name was Bella Darby, literally constructed from Daryl and Virginia Zanuck. This wasn't unique. This was how Hollywood worked. Daryl F. Zanuck, Fox's serial womanizer, and the actress he destroyed across town at 20th Century Fox, another mogul was perfecting his own method of control, one that would end in a Paris apartment 15 years later with the smell of gas and a woman alone. In 1952, Daryl F. Zanuck discovered a young Polish actress named Bella Wegier in France. He changed her name to Bella Darby, a combination of his first name, Daryl, and his wife Virginia's name. Even her professional identity became a declaration of his possession. What happened next would lead to one of Hollywood's most tragic endings. Zanuck didn't bother with the paternal manipulation that Mayer favored. He was more direct. He had co-founded 20th Century Fox in 1935 after a successful run as production chief at Warner Brothers, and he had a genuine gift for recognizing talent. He discovered Betty Grable, Gene Tierney, and gave Marilyn Monroe some of her earliest opportunities. His eye for stars was legendary throughout Hollywood. But so was something else: his affairs with the actresses under contract to him. Unlike some moguls who operated in shadows, Zanuck was remarkably open about his romantic entanglements with contract players. His wife, Virginia, stayed married to him throughout decades of very public infidelity. She later told the press that she understood the movie business, a statement that revealed just how normalized this behavior had become. If the mogul's own wife accepted it as simply part of how Hollywood worked, how could a young actress under contract object without seeming naive or difficult? When Zanuck discovered Bella Wegier, he was immediately captivated. He left Virginia and his children, brought Bella to Hollywood, and launched an enormous publicity campaign to make her a star. Fox invested heavily in her career, putting her in prominent films and promoting her as the next great discovery. There was one problem: Bella Darby couldn't act. Or perhaps more accurately, she couldn't act in the roles Zanuck chose for her, in the style Hollywood demanded. Her films flopped one after another. The Egyptian in 1954, The Racers in 1955. Audiences simply didn't respond to her. For Zanuck, who had staked his reputation on discovering her, this was both a professional embarrassment and a financial disaster. What Zanuck did next shocked even Hollywood's jaded insiders. In 1956, he ended the affair as abruptly as he'd begun it. Bella's career at Fox ended the same day. What happened next illustrates the brutal reality of what it meant to be a mogul's favorite and then lose that status. No other studio in Hollywood would hire Bella Darby. She wasn't blacklisted in any formal sense. There was no list, no official decree. But everyone in the industry knew she was Zanuck's girl, that their affair had ended badly, and that hiring her might offend one of the most powerful men in Hollywood. She returned to France where she'd been discovered, but her career never recovered. She struggled with gambling addiction and mounting financial troubles. In 1971, 15 years after Zanuck had discarded her, Bella Darby made several attempts to end her suffering. She finally succeeded on September 11th of that year. She turned on the gas in her small Paris apartment and ended her pain at age 42. She was found alone, forgotten by the industry that had briefly celebrated her, reduced to a footnote in Daryl F. Zanuck's biography. Zanuck himself lived 8 more years, honored by the industry he'd helped build, remembered for the great films he'd produced and the stars he'd discovered. Bella Darby's name rarely appeared in his obituaries. When it did, she was mentioned only as one of his romantic interests, a phrase that sanitized the power dynamics and erased the tragedy. The woman whose professional name was literally constructed from his and his wife's names had been completely consumed by his ego and then discarded when she failed to generate profits. Her final act was the terrible consequence of what it meant to be owned by a Hollywood mogul. Harry Cohn, Columbia's crude tyrant and the star he remade. While Zanuck at least maintained some pretense of romance with his affairs, Harry Cohn at Columbia Pictures dispensed with such niceties entirely. Cohn was crude, vulgar, and proud of it. His nicknames around Hollywood said it all: White Fang and King Cohn. He'd built Columbia from a Poverty Row studio into a major player through sheer force of will and an almost supernatural ability to recognize commercial potential in scripts and stars. Cohn's office at Columbia was designed to intimidate. His desk sat on a raised platform, so he literally looked down on everyone who entered. When he finally granted an audience, he was known to scream obscenities, throw telephones, and hurl furniture. But his cruelty wasn't limited to explosive anger. He also exercised a more insidious form of control, the complete transformation of women under contract to him. Margarita Carmen Cancino arrived at Columbia in 1937. She was the daughter of Spanish dancers, had been performing since childhood, and possessed genuine talent. But Cohn looked at her and saw problems. Her hairline was too low, her hair too dark, her name too ethnic. She was too Spanish for the all-American starlet image that Cohn believed would sell tickets. His solution was comprehensive transformation. The hairline came first. Cohn sent Margarita to electrolysis treatments that would last over a year. Painful sessions where needles delivered electric current to individual hair follicles to destroy them permanently. The process raised her hairline by a full inch, giving her the high forehead that Cohn considered more refined, more Anglo. Then, her naturally dark hair was dyed auburn red. Her name was changed to Rita Hayworth, the surname borrowed from her mother's maiden name, Haworth, with a Y added for easier pronunciation. Even her accent was modified, softened, made less identifiably Latin. The transformation worked brilliantly from a commercial standpoint. Rita Hayworth became one of Hollywood's most iconic stars, the ultimate love goddess. Her image in a negligee kneeling on a bed, a publicity photo for Gilda, became one of the most reproduced images of the era. Soldiers carried it into battle during World War II. She was desired by millions. But Rita herself struggled with the split between who she had been and who she'd been forced to become. Years later, in interviews, Rita spoke carefully about Harry Cohn. She acknowledged that he'd made her a star, but she also said something revealing. He was in love with me, but it wasn't the kind of love a woman wants. That quote, verified in multiple interviews she gave late in life, suggests something darker than simple professional interest. Cohn's love was possessive, controlling, transformative in ways that erased Margarita Cancino to create Rita Hayworth. Kim Novak, another Columbia star of the 1950s, was even more direct in later interviews. She reported that Cohn dictated her diet, her wardrobe, her public appearances, and attempted to control her romantic relationships. "I was a commodity," she told an interviewer decades later. "Not a person, not an artist. A commodity to be shaped, marketed, and controlled by Harry Cohn's vision of what would sell." When Cohn suffered a fatal heart attack in 1958, his funeral became the subject of one of Hollywood's most famous jokes. The service drew enormous crowds. Over 1,000 people packed the chapel. Red Skelton, the comedian, looked around at the masses and quipped, "It proves what Harry always said. Give the public what they want and they'll show up." The implication was clear. People hadn't come to mourn Harry Cohn. They'd come to make sure he was really gone. Rita Hayworth reportedly told friends she felt free for the first time after his passing. But the damage was permanent. She spent her entire life feeling caught between two identities: Margarita, the Spanish dancer's daughter, and Rita, the manufactured American goddess. In her final years, suffering from Alzheimer's disease, she would sometimes revert to speaking Spanish, as if her original self was finally breaking through the constructed facade. When she passed in 1987 at age 68, she had lived 3 decades beyond Harry Cohn, but never fully escaped what he'd done to her identity. Louis B. Mayer, MGM's tyrannical father. But erasing someone's identity wasn't the only form of control. Louis B. Mayer at MGM perfected something even more insidious: chemical dependency. Frances Ethel Gum was 12 years old when MGM started giving her pills, amphetamines to suppress her appetite during 16-hour shooting days, barbiturates to knock her out when she couldn't sleep, then more amphetamines to wake her up. Every single day. The studio called them pep pills and sleeping pills, harmless, medicinal. But they were creating an addiction in a child that would eventually claim her life. Judy Garland would spend her entire existence trying to escape what Louis B. Mayer did to her, starting at age 12. Louis B. Mayer sat in his office at Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, controlling every single one of the stars that made MGM's boast. More stars than there are in heaven, a reality. To the public, he was the ultimate success story. a Jewish immigrant from Russia who arrived in America with nothing and built an empire. He was the father figure who discovered Judy Garland, who nurtured Elizabeth Taylor, who created Lana Turner. Stars called him father, not as a joke, but as a requirement. He insisted on it, and for decades, America believed the image. Louis B. Mayer, the benevolent patriarch of Hollywood's most glamorous studio. What audiences never saw was what happened behind the closed doors of his office, where young contract players learned that defying father meant professional annihilation. Judy's daughter, Lorna Luft, later confirmed what many suspected. Her mother's lifelong struggle with substance dependency began at MGM under Mayer's direct orders. Studio doctors prescribed the pills. Studio employees administered them. Judy was 13 years old, filming The Wizard of Oz, taking pills to stay thin and energetic for the cameras, then more pills to sleep, then more pills to wake up. This wasn't negligence. This was systematic chemical control of a minor. But Mayer's power extended far beyond pills. The 7-year contracts he required gave him legal authority over nearly every aspect of his stars' lives. Want to get married? You needed Mayer's approval? Want to refuse a role? Mayer would suspend your contract. You couldn't work anywhere else. You earned no money, but your contract time stopped. When you finally submitted and returned to work, those suspension months didn't count toward your 7 years. You owed him that time back. A 7-year contract could easily become 9 or 10 years if you defied him enough times. Mayer would call struggling stars to his desk and deliver speeches about family, about loyalty, about how MGM was their home and he was their father. Then, if persuasion failed, his famous temper would erupt. Stars left his office in tears, knowing that their careers hung entirely on his whims. The psychological manipulation was perhaps more damaging than any physical abuse. By positioning himself as father, Mayer made professional defiance feel like family betrayal. The cruelest irony is that Mayer faced no consequences for any of this during his lifetime. His downfall came in 1951, but not from justice, simply from declining box office receipts and studio politics. He was pushed out of MGM, the company he'd built, because his films were no longer making enough money. He spent his final years bitter and diminished. But he never faced legal accountability for what he'd done to Judy Garland or countless others. When he passed in 1957, the industry honored him with tributes and eulogies celebrating his contributions to cinema. Judy Garland lived 12 more years. She struggled constantly with the addiction Mayer had created, cycling through marriages and money problems, still brilliant but increasingly fragile. On June 22, 1969, she was found in her London apartment at age 47, the victim of the pills that MGM had given her as a child. The woman who had sung Over the Rainbow and captured America's imagination never escaped the prison that Louis B. Mayer had built for her starting at age 12. His control tactics, the contracts, the suspensions, the psychological manipulation, the chemical dependency, became the template that other moguls would follow throughout Hollywood's golden age. Howard Hughes, the billionaire who collected women. If Cohn controlled women by remaking them physically, Howard Hughes preferred a different approach. He simply bought them. Hughes represented a unique threat in Hollywood because he wasn't just a studio mogul. He was a billionaire industrialist who owned Hughes Aircraft, Trans World Airlines, and eventually RKO Studios. His wealth dwarfed that of any other figure in the entertainment industry. Where other moguls were rich, Hughes was incomprehensibly wealthy. And he used that wealth to collect women the way other millionaires collected art. Hughes's public image was carefully cultivated. The dashing aviator who set speed records, the eccentric genius who designed aircraft, the eligible bachelor who dated Hollywood's most beautiful women. His romances with Katharine Hepburn, Ava Gardner, and Ginger Rogers were celebrated in gossip columns. He seemed like the ultimate fantasy. Brilliant, rich, handsome, exciting. What the public didn't see was the contract system he'd created specifically to keep women available for his personal use. Starting in the late 1940s, Hughes began signing young actresses to personal contracts through RKO Studios, which he'd purchased in 1948. These weren't normal studio contracts intended to put actresses in films and build their careers. These were contracts designed to prevent them from working while keeping them financially dependent on Hughes. He would sign a woman, put her on a generous salary, then ensure she never appeared in any RKO production. She'd be paid to wait, to be available when Hughes wanted her. Jean Peters provides the clearest example of what this meant. Hughes signed her to RKO when she was a promising young actress with genuine talent and a bright future ahead of her. He made her a few films early on, building her profile, getting audiences interested in her. Then he essentially retired her while she was still in her 20s and at the peak of her career potential. She remained under contract, drawing a salary, but not working. For years, Jean Peters existed in a strange limbo, financially secure but professionally stagnant, unable to pursue the career she dreamed of because Hughes's contract prevented her from working for anyone else. The isolation deepened when she married Hughes in 1957 in a secret ceremony. She lived with him in increasingly isolated circumstances as his mental illness, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and paranoia worsened through the 1960s. Friends later reported that she described feeling trapped, unable to leave without destroying what remained of her career, unable to work, unable to live freely. When Hughes finally passed in 1976, Peters inherited a substantial fortune. But friends reported that she'd told them she'd paid for every penny. The years of isolation, of having her career controlled, of living according to Hughes's increasingly paranoid demands. Peters wasn't alone. Hughes had created an entire system of contracted captivity. Terry Moore claimed she had secretly married Hughes in 1949 aboard his yacht, a claim that remained contested but that she maintained until her passing. Whether legally married or not, Moore wrote in her memoir about the control Hughes exercised. Employees who followed her, reported on her movements, restricted her freedom. She described feeling imprisoned, even while living in luxury. Faith Domergue had a similar experience. Hughes discovered her when she was 16 years old in 1939, signed her to a personal contract, controlled her career for years, and prevented her from working consistently. In her later memoir, she wrote about feeling trapped by Hughes's obsessive control, unable to pursue the career she dreamed of, stuck in what she called luxurious captivity. Jane Russell's experience was slightly different, but no less controlling. Hughes didn't keep Russell from working. Her career in films like The Outlaw and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes was successful, but he exercised obsessive control over her image. He personally designed the underwire bra she wore in The Outlaw, fixating on how her body would appear on screen. He micromanaged every aspect of her publicity, every photograph, every interview. Russell later wrote in her autobiography about Hughes's need to control her professional image completely, describing him as obsessed with controlling me. The women kept in houses Hughes owned, drawing salaries but not working, became an open secret in Hollywood. Industry insiders knew about Hughes's stable of contract players who never appeared in films, but his wealth made him effectively untouchable. He could afford to pay women indefinitely without needing them to generate income through films. For him, the contracts weren't business investments. They were methods of possession. As Hughes's mental illness worsened through the 1950s and 60s, he became more reclusive and his control more erratic. When he passed in 1976 at age 70, he was alone on an airplane, emaciated and barely recognizable. Several women who'd been under contract to him gave interviews in later years describing their time with Hughes as imprisonment, captivity, and being owned. They'd been paid well for their captivity, living in nice homes, but unable to work, unable to leave without destroying their careers, unable to live freely. If you're shocked by how these men used contracts and power to control women's lives and careers, please subscribe, because the next revelation might be the most disturbing of all. You might be thinking, surely not everyone in Hollywood was a predator. Surely some moguls were different. And you'd be right, kind of, because our next subject didn't exploit women in that way. He didn't have affairs or keep actresses in gilded cages. Walt Disney's cruelty was different, some would say cleaner. But for the men whose careers he destroyed, it was just as devastating. And because his victims were artists, not starlets, and because his image has been protected more carefully than any other figure in entertainment history, his story has been buried deepest of all. Hit that subscribe button, because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about Hollywood's golden age. Walt Disney, Uncle Walt's hidden cruelty. While Mayer, Zanuck, Cohn, and Hughes used their studio power to control women's personal lives and bodies. Walt Disney built his empire on a different kind of exploitation. Disney's carefully constructed image. Uncle Walt, the gentle creator of childhood magic, the visionary who gave us Mickey Mouse and Snow White in Disneyland, remains one of the most protected myths in entertainment history. Even today, the Disney Corporation spends enormous resources maintaining that image. But behind the fairy tales and theme parks, Walt Disney ran his animation studio with the same ruthless control as any Hollywood mogul, crushing those who dared to challenge him. Disney's public persona was masterfully crafted. The Midwestern nice guy who just wanted to make children happy. The artistic dreamer who saw magic where others saw only drawings on paper. The patriarchal figure who gathered his artists, whom he called my boys, into a creative family. This image wasn't entirely false. Disney did have genuine artistic vision, and his innovations in animation were revolutionary. But the reality behind the studio gates at Burbank was far less wholesome. By the late 1930s, Disney's studio was producing masterpieces. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937 had been a colossal success, proving that feature-length animation could work artistically and commercially. But the animators who created that magic were poorly paid relative to the profits their work generated. Disney kept costs low by paying most animators modest salaries, while he took personal credit for their innovations. The opening credits of Disney films rarely acknowledged individual animators. Everything was Walt Disney's, as if he'd drawn every frame himself. When animators began organizing to form a union in 1941, Disney took it as a personal betrayal. He couldn't understand why his boys would need a union when he was taking such good care of them. The reality was that many animators were struggling financially while Disney's company prospered. The union drive gained momentum, and in May 1941, the animators went on strike. The strike lasted 5 brutal weeks. Disney responded with fury. He called the strikers communists and traitors. He took the strike personally, seeing it not as a labor dispute about wages and working conditions, but as an attack on him and his paternal authority. The studio brought in strikebreakers. Ugly confrontations occurred at the picket lines. The Disney studio, which had promoted itself as one big happy family, was torn apart by the conflict. When the strike finally ended, Disney exacted revenge. He compiled lists of strike leaders and prominent union supporters, then systematically fired them. One of the most prominent was Art Babbitt, one of Disney's most talented animators who had created Goofy and done groundbreaking work on films like Fantasia. Babbitt had been outspoken in supporting the union, and Disney never forgave him. Disney fired him in violation of the strike settlement agreement, leading to a years-long legal battle. Babbitt's case eventually went all the way to the Supreme Court. He won his job back, but Disney made his remaining time at the studio miserable. The atmosphere at Disney Studios after the strike became one of fear and suspicion. Animators knew that any sign of disloyalty, any criticism, any union activity could mean the end of their careers. Ward Kimball, one of Disney's 9 old men, his core group of lead animators, later gave an interview where he said Disney could be absolutely vicious toward those he felt had betrayed him. That quote, from someone inside Disney's inner circle, reveals how different the reality was from the Uncle Walt image. Disney's vindictiveness extended beyond his own studio. In 1947, he testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee during the Hollywood blacklist era. He named former employees whom he believed were communist sympathizers. This testimony is public record. The congressional transcripts still exist. Disney's testimony helped destroy careers throughout Hollywood, marking people as unemployable for political views or union activities. The man who created Pinocchio and Dumbo used his influence to ensure that animators who defied him never worked in Hollywood again. When Disney passed in 1966 at age 65, his image was immediately further sanitized. The strike, the firings, the blacklist testimony, all of it was buried beneath an avalanche of hagiography about his genius and vision. The Disney Corporation, which became one of the most powerful entertainment companies in the world, has spent billions over the decades maintaining Walt's pristine reputation. They've been remarkably successful. Most people today have no idea about the strike, about the fired animators, about Disney's HUAC testimony. The animators Disney fired or blacklisted struggled for years. Some never worked in animation again. Art Babbitt, who created Goofy, spent the better part of a decade fighting Disney in court just to get his job back. And when he finally did, Disney made his life so miserable that he eventually left anyway. These were artists whose work had helped build Disney's empire, and their reward for seeking fair wages was career destruction. The irony is almost too perfect. The happiest place on earth, Disneyland, was built by a man who created fear and suspicion among his employees. The fairy tales with happy endings were produced by artists who lived in terror of their boss's vindictive nature. Uncle Walt, the gentle grandfather figure who loved children, destroyed careers without mercy when his authority was challenged. This wasn't the kind of exploitation that some other moguls practiced. This was economic and psychological control, labor abuse, and the systematic destruction of those who dared to organize for their rights. Olivia de Havilland versus Jack Warner, the woman who broke the system. But while Disney's cruelty was economic and psychological, and while Mayer, Zanuck, Cohn, and Hughes each practiced their own forms of control, the legal system that enabled all of them was even more insidious. That system seemed unbreakable, eternal, simply the way Hollywood worked, until one woman decided to fight back. Olivia de Havilland was a star at Warner Brothers, known for films like The Adventures of Robin Hood in 1938 and Gone with the Wind in 1939. Though she'd been loaned to Selznick for that production, by 1943, she had served her 7-year contract. She'd been professional, successful, and profitable for Warner Brothers. She was ready to move on, to choose her own projects, to work as a free agent. But Jack Warner claimed she owed him more time. Warner's reasoning was simple and, under the existing contract system, legally sound. During her 7 years, de Havilland had occasionally refused roles that Warner assigned to her, roles she believed were beneath her abilities or wrong for her career. Each time she refused, Warner suspended her contract. She couldn't work for anyone else during these suspensions, and she earned no money. But according to Warner's interpretation, those suspension periods didn't count toward her 7 years. She had to make up that time. Under his calculations, she potentially owed him several more years of servitude. This wasn't theoretical. Under Warner's interpretation of the standard studio contract, an actress or actor who refused enough roles could be owned by a studio indefinitely. Every suspension extended the contract. A 7-year agreement could become 9 years, 12 years, effectively forever, if the star was defiant enough. It was legal slavery, dressed up in Hollywood glamour. De Havilland made a decision that would require extraordinary courage. She sued Warner Brothers in California Superior Court in 1943, arguing that the contract suspensions couldn't extend her agreement beyond 7 calendar years. She was 27 years old, taking on one of the most powerful studios in Hollywood with virtually unlimited legal resources. The response was immediate and devastating. Warner Brothers ensured that de Havilland was blacklisted by every major studio in Hollywood. If she won her case, it would undermine the entire contract system that gave studios absolute power over their talent. The studios had to make an example of her, to show what happened to stars who challenged the system. She couldn't get work anywhere. Her income stopped. Her bills continued. Her career momentum, built over years of excellent performances, evaporated. The legal battle lasted 18 months. During that year and a half, de Havilland went from age 27 to nearly 29. Prime years for a female actress in that era. Years she should have been cementing her stardom with great roles. Instead, she was trapped in legal proceedings, watching her savings dwindle, wondering if she'd just destroyed her entire career on a matter of principle. Her own sister made it worse. Joan Fontaine, also a successful actress, was pressured by studios to publicly denounce her sister's lawsuit. The relationship between the two sisters, never warm, was permanently shattered by the pressures of the case. Years later, both women would write memoirs that barely mentioned each other, the bitterness of that betrayal still fresh decades later. Warner Brothers had every advantage: money, lawyers, industry support, the weight of established practice. They argued that the contract system was essential to the studio business model, that without the ability to extend contracts through suspensions, the entire industry would collapse. They painted de Havilland as ungrateful, selfish, a troublemaker who wanted special treatment after Warner Brothers had made her a star. But in March 1945, the California Court of Appeal ruled in de Havilland's favor. The The court held that contract suspensions could not extend an employment agreement beyond 7 calendar years from the date of signing. 7 years meant 7 years, regardless of how much time the employee had spent on suspension. The ruling was clear, definitive, and revolutionary. Warner Brothers could have appealed to the California Supreme Court, but they didn't. The studio system was already under pressure from multiple directions: antitrust actions, changing economic conditions, stars gaining power. Warner chose to accept the ruling rather than risk an even more definitive statement from the state's highest court. The decision became known as the de Havilland Law. It's codified today as California Labor Code Section 2855. It remains in effect, protecting every entertainment industry worker in California. The law's principle has been cited in contract disputes for over 7 decades, including in cases involving recording artists like Keisha, who tried to escape abusive contracts. But for Olivia de Havilland personally, victory came at an enormous cost. She'd lost nearly 2 years of work during the prime of her career. When she returned to films, studios punished her subtly. She got roles, but often inferior ones. She was seen as difficult, a troublemaker. The industry had long memories. She eventually moved to Paris in 1953, partly to escape Hollywood's retribution and partly to start fresh in a city that appreciated her work without the baggage of her lawsuit. She did win 2 Academy Awards for Best Actress, for To Each His Own in 1946 and The Heiress in 1949, proving her talent was undeniable. But her career never quite reached the heights it might have if she hadn't had to fight for her freedom. The momentum she'd built before the lawsuit, the carefully constructed star image, the industry goodwill, all of it was damaged by her decision to challenge the system. De Havilland lived an extraordinarily long life, passing in July 2020 at age 104. She was the last surviving major star of Hollywood's golden age. In interviews during her final years, she reflected on the lawsuit. Reporters would ask if she regretted it, given the cost to her career. Her answer was always the same: "I couldn't be someone's property. I had to fight, not just for myself, but for the principle. Everyone deserves to own their own life." She received letters throughout her later life from actors thanking her for fighting. Every time a performer in California benefits from contract protections, they're benefiting from Olivia de Havilland's courage in 1943. She didn't just win her own freedom, she began the process of dismantling the legal framework that had given moguls like Mayer, Warner, Zanuck, Cohn, Hughes, and Disney such absolute power. Jack Warner, the man she'd sued, continued running Warner Brothers until 1967. When he passed in 1978, he had never apologized for the contract system he'd used to control careers for decades. But his power had been broken by one woman's lawsuit, and he knew it. The studio system would continue for another 2 decades after de Havilland's victory, but it would never again have the absolute control it once wielded. Olivia de Havilland's courage changed Hollywood forever, and her story is just one of the documented battles we're uncovering. Which of these revelations has shocked you most? What other dark golden age topics should we investigate? Comment below. Your suggestions guide our research into Hollywood's hidden history. David O. Selznick, the producer who destroyed what he loved. While de Havilland's legal battle challenged the contract system itself, some moguls didn't need contracts to destroy lives. They could do it through sheer obsessive control. David O. Selznick was different from the other moguls we've examined. He wasn't running a major studio. He was an independent producer, which gave him a certain artistic prestige. He'd produced Gone with the Wind and Rebecca, 2 of the most celebrated films in cinema history. He was married to Irene Mayer, Louis B. Mayer's daughter, making him Hollywood royalty. He had everything: success, family, respect. Then in 1941, he discovered Jennifer Jones. Jones was born Phyllis Isley in Oklahoma, had married young to actor Robert Walker, and was struggling to break into films. Selznick saw her screen test and became convinced she had extraordinary talent. He signed her, changed her name to Jennifer Jones, and began controlling every detail of her career. But his interest quickly became much more than professional. By 1945, Selznick had left Irene for Jones, creating a major Hollywood scandal. Irene Mayer Selznick was beloved in the industry, the daughter of the most powerful mogul, and a sophisticated woman who'd supported her husband's career. The divorce was messy and public. Jones, meanwhile, had left Robert Walker, who was devastated. Walker's career and personal life spiraled downward. He struggled with dependency and emotional problems stemming from the divorce. In 1951, at age 32, Walker was found in his home following a reaction to medication administered by his physician. Everyone in Hollywood understood that the young actor had been destroyed by losing his wife to Selznick. With both marriages ended, Selznick and Jones were finally together. But rather than bringing Jones happiness, Selznick's obsessive attention became suffocating. Their correspondence, now archived at the University of Texas, reveals the extent of his control. Hundreds of letters and memos show Selznick micromanaging every aspect of Jones's career and life. Every role, every script, every costume, every public appearance, every interview. He wrote her detailed instructions on how to speak, how to move, how to present herself. Nothing was too small for his attention. Selznick was addicted to amphetamines, which fueled his obsessive work habits and increasingly erratic behavior. Studio employees described his mania in oral histories, working 72 hours straight, sending 30-page memos about minor script details, raging at perceived slights. Jones was expected to match his energy, to work constantly, to be available always for his direction and control. The psychological toll on Jones became increasingly apparent through the 1950s. She was hospitalized multiple times for what was described at the time as nervous exhaustion or emotional problems. These psychiatric hospitalizations appear in biographies and contemporary accounts. She made at least one attempt to harm herself, though the details were kept quiet at the time. Friends later reported that Jones felt trapped by Selznick's obsessive control, but also psychologically dependent on him. He'd shaped her career so completely that she didn't know who she was without his direction. Selznick collapsed from a heart attack in 1965 at age 63. He was working, as always. He'd been in the midst of producing yet another project. Jones, at 46 years old, was suddenly without the man who'd controlled every aspect of her life for nearly a quarter century. Friends described her as lost, unmoored, unsure how to make decisions without Selznick's constant input. Then, in 1976, 11 years after Selznick's passing, Jones suffered another devastating blow. Her son Michael Walker, her child with Robert Walker, the husband she'd left for Selznick, fell from a building in New York City at age 33. The tragedy appears in public records and contemporary news reports. Jones blamed herself, according to friends. She believed that her abandonment of Robert Walker, choosing Selznick over her family, had ultimately destroyed her son. Jennifer Jones lived another 33 years after Michael's loss, finally passing herself in 2009 at age 90. She received psychiatric treatment throughout those decades. She rarely spoke publicly about Selznick in her later years. When she did, her comments were carefully neutral, acknowledging his professional importance to her career, but saying little about their personal relationship. Friends and relatives reported that she never fully recovered from the two losses. Selznick's controlling presence that she'd simultaneously depended on and resented, and Michael's fall, which she carried as a burden of guilt for the rest of her life. The woman who'd won an Academy Award for The Song of Bernadette in 1943, who'd been celebrated for performances in Duel in the Sun and other films, spent most of her life haunted by the consequences of one man's obsessive need to control her. Selznick's love for Jones wasn't nurturing or supportive. It was consuming, suffocating, destructive. The archived correspondence proves it. Hundreds of pages of instructions, demands, control. This wasn't a partnership. This was ownership dressed up as devotion. The tragedy of David O. Selznick and Jennifer Jones reminds us that abuse doesn't always involve violence or coercion in the traditional sense. Sometimes, it's the slow erosion of someone's autonomy, the gradual destruction of their ability to make their own decisions, the creation of psychological dependence that becomes indistinguishable from prison. Selznick may have believed he loved Jennifer Jones, but his love destroyed her son and consumed 3 decades of her life. Samuel Goldwyn, the immigrant who became a ruthless mogul. While Selznick's obsession was personal and psychological, Samuel Goldwyn practiced a different kind of cruelty, the ruthless destruction of careers in the name of business. Goldwyn's story should have been purely inspirational. Born Shmuel Gelbfis in Warsaw, Poland in 1879, he arrived in America in 1898 with nothing. He couldn't speak English. He worked as a glove salesman in New York, saved his money obsessively, learned the language, and gradually worked his way into the film business. By 1916, he'd co-founded Goldwyn Pictures, which would later merge with Metro Pictures and Louis B. Mayer's company to form Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. The G in MGM literally stood for Goldwyn, even though he was pushed out before the merger was complete. Undeterred, he founded Samuel Goldwyn Productions as an independent producer and proceeded to make some of Hollywood's finest films. He was the ultimate self-made individual, the immigrant who achieved the American dream. His story should have ended there, as pure inspiration. But success didn't make Goldwyn kind. Instead, he seemed to learn Hollywood's worst lessons. His treatment of those beneath him, particularly actors who failed to meet his expectations, revealed a man who could be as cruel as any studio mogul. In 1932, Goldwyn discovered Russian actress Anna Sten in Europe. He became convinced she would be the next Greta Garbo, a European actress with mystique and talent who would captivate American audiences. He brought her to Hollywood and spent an enormous amount of money on her publicity campaign. Trade papers ran ads proclaiming her as the newest sensation. Goldwyn put her in 3 expensive productions: Nana in 1934, We Live Again in 1934, and The Wedding Night in 1935. All 3 films flopped badly. American audiences simply didn't respond to Anna Sten. Perhaps it was her thick Russian accent, perhaps Goldwyn's miscasting of her, perhaps simply bad luck. But the result was the same. Goldwyn had invested heavily in making her a star, and she'd failed to generate returns on that investment. What Goldwyn did next shocked even Hollywood's jaded insiders. He publicly blamed Anna Sten for his financial losses. He gave interviews to trade papers calling her ungrateful and difficult. He took out ads in Variety and The Hollywood Reporter that openly criticized her. This wasn't normal business practice. Producers didn't typically publicly attack actors this way. But Goldwyn was furious, and he wanted everyone in Hollywood to know that Anna Sten's failure was her fault, not his. The effect was devastating. No other studio would hire Anna Sten after Goldwyn's public attack. Why would they? If Samuel Goldwyn, one of Hollywood's most respected producers, said she was impossible to work with and a bad investment, who would take the risk? Anna Sten's career effectively ended at age 27. She worked occasionally in small roles over the following decades, but she never recovered from Goldwyn's destruction of her reputation. Goldwyn's cruelty extended beyond Anna Sten. Vilma Banky had been a major star during the silent era, but when sound arrived in the late 1920s, her thick Hungarian accent made the transition difficult. Rather than helping her transition to character roles or working with her accent, Goldwyn publicly humiliated her. He made jokes about her pronunciation in interviews. He allowed her to flounder without support. Her career ended, and she retired from films entirely by 1932. Multiple witnesses over the years described Goldwyn's office rages in oral histories, throwing furniture, screaming at employees, firing people on the spot without notice or severance. He sued frequently, often over minor slights or perceived disloyalty. Employment contracts meant nothing when Goldwyn decided someone had failed him. Yet somehow, Samuel Goldwyn's reputation remained largely untarnished. His famous malapropisms, "A verbal contract isn't worth the paper it's written on, include me out," made him seem like a lovable buffoon, a charming immigrant who'd never quite mastered English. These Goldwynisms, whether authentic or cultivated, served as perfect image rehabilitation. How could anyone who said such silly things be truly threatening? The malapropisms disguised the cruelty, made him seem harmless and funny, rather than vindictive and destructive. Goldwyn passed in 1974 at age 91. He was celebrated as an independent producer and industry pioneer. His obituaries praised his artistic standards and business acumen. Anna Sten's name rarely appeared in coverage of his life and career. When mentioned at all, she was just a failed experiment, a footnote. Anna Sten outlived Samuel Goldwyn by nearly 20 years, passing in 1993 at age 85. She'd worked small roles in B-movies and television for decades, never escaping Goldwyn's shadow, never recovering the career she'd had in Europe before he brought her to Hollywood. She gave occasional interviews in her later years, and when asked about Goldwyn, her comments were brief and carefully neutral. But the pain was evident. He'd spent a fortune making her famous, then spent his considerable influence destroying her when she failed to make him richer. Samuel Goldwyn's story reminds us that not all abuse in Hollywood's golden age was physical or psychological obsession. Sometimes it was simply ruthless business practice, using people up, discarding them when they didn't deliver profits, publicly destroying their reputations to protect your own. Goldwyn had achieved the American dream, rising from poverty to power. But in doing so, he adopted the cruelest practices of the system he'd joined. Success taught him to be merciless. By now you've seen the pattern. 8 different men, same fundamental dynamic, absolute power, zero accountability. But how? How did they get away with it for so long? The answer started revealing itself in 1943, when Olivia de Havilland's lawsuit forced Warner Brothers to read their standard contract language into public court record for the first time. What those court documents showed was shocking. The foundation of the entire system was the 7-year contract. These weren't employment agreements in the normal sense. They were ownership papers. When a young actress or actor signed with a studio, they were signing away control of their professional lives and, often, their personal lives as well. The standard contract included provisions that would be unthinkable today. Morality clauses that gave studios the right to terminate employment for any behavior deemed immoral, with the studio alone deciding what qualified as immoral. Weight requirements and appearance standards that could be enforced through contract suspension. Approval rights over marriages and divorces. Stars literally needed studio permission to wed or separate. But the most insidious provision was the suspension clause revealed in de Havilland's case. If an actor refused a role the studio assigned, the studio could suspend the contract. During the suspension, the actor couldn't work for anyone else, earned no money, and had no career. But the time on suspension didn't count toward the 7 years. When the actor finally submitted and returned to work, they owed the studio that time back. A 7-year contract could easily become 9 or 10 years if an actor was defiant enough. In theory, it could extend indefinitely. Decades later, when MGM's archives were open to researchers, payroll records showed something even more disturbing. Studios maintained their own police forces, not rent-a-cops, but actual former law enforcement officers on staff. MGM's security force was run by former LAPD officers who knew how to intimidate, investigate, and when necessary, cover up crimes. These studio police could make problems disappear before they ever reached actual law enforcement. Above the police were the fixers. The book The Fixers by E.J. Fleming, published in 2004, finally documented how Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling at MGM became legendary for their ability to handle scandals. A star arrested while intoxicated? The fixers could make the arrest record vanish. An actress pregnant out of wedlock? They arranged quiet medical procedures. A star involved in a vehicular incident? Witnesses could be persuaded to remember events differently. Fleming's research uncovered dozens of cases where Mannix and Strickling made scandals disappear, often through a combination of bribes, threats, and leveraging the studio's advertising dollars with newspapers. When journalists interviewed retired gossip columnists in the 1980s, another piece of the puzzle emerged. Hollywood's 2 most powerful gossip columnists, Hedda Hopper and Luella Parsons, were essentially on studio payroll. Not officially. They worked for newspapers, but studios provided them with exclusive stories, access to stars, and advertising revenue. In exchange, Hopper and Parsons buried stories that studios wanted buried and destroyed careers that studios wanted destroyed. Their power was extraordinary. A negative item in Hopper or Parsons' column could end an actor's career overnight, and they used that power in the studio's direction. The studios also maintained relationships with doctors who understood discretion. These physicians prescribed whatever medications the studios requested. Judy Garland's amphetamines and barbiturates came from studio-approved doctors, as her daughter later confirmed. They performed procedures that were not legal but necessary to studio interests. They provided medical excuses when stars needed time away from productions. They treated conditions that stars couldn't allow to become public, and they never, ever spoke about their famous patients. Finally, the studios had the best law firms in California on retainer. If an actor tried to break a contract or fight back in any way, the studio could afford to tie them up in legal proceedings for years. Most actors couldn't afford that kind of legal battle. Even those who could, like Olivia de Havilland, often came close to financial ruin before winning. The threat of endless expensive litigation kept most potential rebels in line. This system persisted from the 1920s through the 1960s because everyone with power benefited from it. The Moguls controlled talent and maximized profits. The press got exclusive access and advertising revenue. The police got employment and turned a blind eye to studio crimes. The doctors made money from their discretion. The lawyers collected enormous fees. Everyone in the system had an incentive to keep it running. What finally broke the system wasn't morality or justice. It was economics. The 1948 Supreme Court decision in United States versus Paramount Pictures forced studios to divest their theater chains, fundamentally changing the business model. Television began competing for audiences in the 1950s. Stars gained more leverage as the studio system weakened, and gradually, the contracts became less ironclad. The power shifted slightly toward talent, and the absolute control that the Moguls had exercised began to erode. But it took decades. Olivia de Havilland won her case in 1945, but Louis B. Mayer didn't leave MGM until 1951. Harry Cohn ran Columbia until his passing in 1958. Walt Disney controlled his studio until his passing in 1966. Jack Warner didn't retire until 1967. These men wielded enormous power for decades, even after the system began cracking, and thousands of careers were controlled, damaged, or destroyed during those years. The 7-year contract, the suspension clause, the studio police, the fixers, the complicit press, the discreet doctors, the legal intimidation. Together, these mechanisms created a system where young people signed away their autonomy in exchange for a chance at stardom. And once they were in the system, the Moguls controlled them absolutely. Jack Warner reprise and de Havilland's legacy. Remember Jack Warner, the man who sued Bette Davis in England, who extended contracts through suspensions, who Olivia de Havilland had to fight for 18 months. After she won in 1945, did he change? No. He continued running Warner Brothers the same way for another 22 years until his retirement in 1967. When he passed in 1978, he had never apologized for the careers he'd controlled or damaged. But Olivia de Havilland's legal victory changed everything for the actors who came after. The de Havilland Law, California Labor Code Section 2855, still protects every entertainment worker in California today. It's why studios can't extend contracts indefinitely through suspensions. It's why actors can leave after 7 years, regardless of how often they've been suspended. Modern entertainment contracts all reflect the limitations that de Havilland's courage imposed. The principle has been cited in contract disputes for over 7 decades. In 2015, recording artist Kesha cited this exact law in her legal battle to escape her recording contract. Though music industry contracts have some different provisions, the de Havilland Law remains one of the most important labor protections in California, affecting not just actors, but anyone in the entertainment industry who signs a multi-year contract. For Olivia de Havilland personally, victory came at an enormous cost. She'd lost nearly 2 years of work during her prime career years, ages 27 to 29. When she returned to films, the industry subtly punished her. She was seen as difficult, a troublemaker. Studios had long memories. She eventually moved to Paris in 1953, partly to escape Hollywood's retribution and partly to build a life on her own terms in a city that appreciated her work without the lawsuit's baggage. She did win 2 Academy Awards for Best Actress, to each his own in 1946 and The Heiress in 1949, proving her talent was undeniable. But her career never quite reached the heights it might have reached without the legal battle. The momentum she'd built, the star image, the industry goodwill, all of it was damaged by her decision to fight. But she never regretted it. Olivia de Havilland lived an extraordinarily long life, passing in Paris in July 2020 at age 104 years old. She was the last surviving major star of Hollywood's golden age. In interviews during her final decades, reporters would ask if she regretted the lawsuit given the cost to her career. Her answer remained consistent. "I couldn't be someone's property. I had to fight, not just for myself, but for the principle. Everyone deserves to own their own life." She received letters throughout her later years from actors thanking her for fighting. Every time a performer in California benefits from contract protections limiting agreements to 7 years, they're benefiting from Olivia de Havilland's courage in 1943. She didn't just win her own freedom. She began the process of dismantling the legal framework that had given moguls such absolute power. The studio system continued for another 2 decades after her victory. But it never again had the complete control it once wielded. One woman's lawsuit started the change. If this investigation into Hollywood's history has opened your eyes to how power, control, and exploitation built the golden age, please like this video and share it. Every story we've told is backed by court records, memoirs, verified interviews, or archival documents. This isn't speculation. It's history. Understanding this history helps us recognize when these patterns repeat today. The stories we've shared are all verifiable. Court records from Warner versus de Havilland, Disney's House Un-American Activities Committee testimony in congressional transcripts, memoirs from Jane Russell, Terry Moore, and others, Rita Hayworth's quotes in multiple interviews, Kim Novak's statement about being a commodity, Lorna Luft discussing her mother, Judy Garland's pills. The Selznick and Jones letters are archived at the University of Texas. Public records showing Bella Darby's passing in Paris and Michael Walker's fall in New York. Studio payroll documents. Trade papers preserving Goldwyn's attacks on Anna Sten. Oral histories from animators and studio employees. These weren't rumors. These were abuses of power that destroyed lives. Judy Garland's addiction, created by MGM when she was 13 years old, eventually claimed her life. Bella Darby ended her suffering in a Paris apartment after Zanuck discarded her. Jennifer Jones spent decades in psychiatric treatment after Selznick's obsessive control. Michael Walker fell from a building, carrying the trauma of his parents' destroyed marriage. Anna Sten's career was destroyed by Samuel Goldwyn's public attacks. Olivia de Havilland lost 2 prime years fighting for her freedom. These weren't minor inconveniences. They were life-altering traumas with permanent consequences. The modern parallels are impossible to ignore. Harvey Weinstein operated using the same playbook: non-disclosure agreements instead of morality clauses, legal intimidation, career threats for refusal, complicit enablers who knew but said nothing. The Me Too movement echoes these golden age battles. Powerful men using industry position to exploit, threaten, and control. Appreciate the art while acknowledging the cost. Singin' in the Rain, Casablanca, Gone with the Wind, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, The Wizard of Oz. These films are genuine masterpieces that continue to move audiences today. They were created within a system of exploitation that we must understand honestly. The stars shone brilliantly, not despite this system, but because refusing to shine meant career destruction. Understanding this truth honors the stars' resilience more than perpetuating comfortable myths about a glamorous golden age that never existed, not for the people who actually lived it. Judy Garland singing Over the Rainbow was a 13-year-old girl addicted to pills that Louis B. Mayer gave her. Rita Hayworth's iconic glamour came after Harry Cohn erased Margarita Cancino's identity. Jennifer Jones's Oscar-winning performance in The Song of Bernadette was created under David O. Selznick's suffocating control. The magic was real, but the cost was also real. These 8 moguls, Louis B. Mayer, Daryl Zanuck, Harry Cohn, Howard Hughes, Walt Disney, Jack Warner, David O. Selznick, Samuel Goldwyn, shaped an industry that still defines entertainment today. The stars they controlled, transformed, obsessed over, and sometimes destroyed, created art that endures. And Olivia de Havilland's courage in fighting the system changed Hollywood forever, creating legal protections that continue to matter. This is the Golden Age Files, where we tell the complete story, backed by evidence, court records, and the voices of those who lived it. These moguls shaped an industry. These stars survived despite them, and Olivia de Havilland changed it forever. Until next time, May we never forget that Hollywood's golden dreams were built on very real suffering and very real courage. Thank you for watching.